The engines arrived on a Wednesday, which was already the wrong day for a miracle. Callum had been under a '94 Silverado when he heard the truck. Diesel rattle, air brakes, the particular groan of hydraulics lowering a flatbed. He slid out on the creeper board, wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't been cleaned since March, and stood in the bay doorway, squinting at the morning. 6 engines, laid out on wooden pallets like bodies after a flood. He didn't move toward them right away. He just looked, the way a man looks at something that doesn't quite fit the day he thought he was going to have. His daughter Mira was sitting on the workbench eating a granola bar, kicking her feet against the steel. She was 7, and she had her mother's habit of watching without saying anything until she had something worth saying. "What are those?" she asked. "Engines," Callum said. "Whose?" "Don't know yet." The driver was already unhooking the chains, moving fast like a man behind schedule. He handed Callum a folded envelope without making eye contact. Inside was a handwritten note on cream stationery, the kind of paper that costs more than Callum's electricity bill. The note said, "These are no longer of use to Alderton Precision. If you can make something of them, they're yours. No obligation, no strings." It was signed E. Alderton. He'd heard the name. Everyone in Copper Falls had heard the name. Eleanor Alderton was the kind of woman whose name got said in a certain tone, not quite reverence, not quite resentment, somewhere in between. Her grandfather had built the original Alderton machine shop in 1951. She had turned it into a precision engineering company worth somewhere north of $200 million. She had also 3 years ago moved the entire operation to a facility outside Calgary, taking 400 jobs with her and leaving downtown Copper Falls with the quiet, particular grief of a town that knows it has been quietly set aside. Callum had never met her. He wasn't sure he wanted to, but the engines were here. He crouched down next to the first one, pressed his palm flat against the casing the way he used to do before diagnostics, before computers, back when reading metal was something a person did with their hands. Cold, dry, surface corrosion, but not deep. He could already see 3 problems and at least 2 reasons those problems weren't fatal. "Dad," Mira said. "Yeah, can we fix them?" He stood up, looked at all 6, ran the back of his knuckle along a valve cover. "We can look," he said. His name was Callum Bryce. He'd been a senior powertrain engineer at a Tier 1 automotive supplier for 11 years. The kind of job where you wore a badge to get through doors and wrote reports that had appendices. He'd liked it, in the way you like a thing that uses you well without ever quite feeling like yours. His wife, Joanna, had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic. 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is its own particular cruelty. Not enough time to prepare, too much time to count. Mira had been 3. She didn't remember her mother the way Callum needed her to, but she remembered enough. She remembered that her mother used to hum while she cooked. She remembered the specific smell of her cardigan. She told him these things sometimes. At dinner, the way children do, matter-of-factly, like reading from a list. He'd left the engineering job 8 months after the funeral, not because he couldn't do it. Because he couldn't do it there, in that building, with that commute, leaving Mira with 3 different sitters in a week, depending on his shift. He'd needed something smaller, something he could shape around her. The garage had been his father's originally. Callum had inherited it along with a box of tools, a customer ledger from 1987, and a building that needed a new roof. He'd put the roof on himself over a long weekend in October, Mira on the ground below handing him things and asking questions about shingles. He was good at the work. Better than good. But this was a town of 11,000 people, and good was usually enough here. He changed oil, aligned suspensions, diagnosed check engine lights for men who'd already looked it up online and half convinced themselves it was something worse. He was patient. He was honest about costs. He didn't upsell. It wasn't the work he'd trained for. He knew that. Some days he felt the gap between what he was doing and what he could do, the way you feel a step that isn't there. A small lurch, quickly recovered. The engines were something else. He pulled the first one into the shop that afternoon and spent 2 hours just looking. Not touching. Looking. The kind of attention that makes other people uncomfortable to watch, Mira had once told him. "You go somewhere else," she'd said. She wasn't wrong. They were V8 performance units. High displacement, close tolerance work. The kind of engine that doesn't belong on a production line. Each one had been built with a specificity that was almost personal. Someone had cared about these. Someone had cared and then stopped, or had been told to stop, and the two things were not the same. He found the first problem on the second engine, a crack in the block, hairline, the kind that shows up under dye penetrant and nowhere else. Serious, but not the death sentence it looked like. He'd seen worse come back. The third engine had a different problem. It took him most of the evening to find it. Long after Mira had fallen asleep on the couch under the shop blanket, her granola bar wrapper still in her hand. When he finally isolated it, he sat back on the stool and looked at the ceiling. It wasn't a mechanical failure. The timing specs had been changed. Not worn, changed. Someone had adjusted the calibration on this engine after it left the build sheet. On purpose, which meant one of two things. Either someone had been trying to fix a problem that didn't exist in the documentation, or someone had been trying to create one. He didn't know which yet. But he wrote it down. Eleanor Alderton came to the shop 3 weeks later. He hadn't expected her. He'd sent one letter. Paper, not email, because the stationery had suggested she was that kind of person, thanking her for the engines and describing briefly what he'd found so far. He hadn't asked for anything. He'd just told her the truth, because that seemed like the right thing to do with information that complicated. She arrived in a dark blue Land Rover, sensible shoes, a coat that was expensive in the way that tries not to look expensive. She was in her mid-50s, maybe the kind of mid-50s that comes from having spent your life doing things rather than avoiding them. She shook his hand without the hesitation some people had about the state of his hands. Mira was at school. He was grateful for that. "I read your letter 3 times, she said, standing in the bay, looking at the engine he'd been working on. "I figured there was a chance you already knew," he said. "I didn't." She said it simply, without the defensiveness he'd half expected. "I signed off on disposing of those engines because I was told they were unrecoverable. The report came from my head of production operations." She paused. "Leonard Foss. Was the report his own work?" She looked at him. "That's the question, isn't it?" He pulled the documentation he'd compiled, a folder, nothing fancy, but thorough. She took it and read standing up, one hand braced on the workbench, the coat still on. She read slowly. That told him something. "The calibration change on Unit 3, she said without looking up. "Yeah. Do you know when it was made?" "Based on the oxidation pattern on the adjacent components, before the engines were flagged as failed. Maybe 6, 8 months before." She closed the folder, set it down. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and Callum didn't push. He'd learned in 11 years of engineering meetings that silence after information was often where the real thinking happened. "What do you need to continue?" she asked. "Time," he said. "Parts for the block repair on Unit 2, I can source those. Access to the original build specs, if you still have them. And I'd like to know if there were any performance complaints logged on these engines before they were pulled." She nodded once, like someone confirming an item on a list. "I'll get you what I have," she said. She left without giving him her number. He found a business card in the folder when he picked it up, tucked inside the front cover, where she must have slipped it while she was reading. An old card from before the move to Calgary, Copper Falls address. He put it on the workbench next to the dye penetrant. The build specs arrived 4 days later, physical copies in a courier envelope. He spread them across the workbench and weighted the corners with sockets. He worked early mornings and evenings when the shop was quiet. The paying work happened in between. The oil changes, the brake jobs, the steady, ordinary rhythm of a garage in a small town. He didn't mention the Alderton engines to anyone. Not because he was hiding anything. Because there was nothing to say yet, and in his experience, talking about a thing before you understood, it was a good way to understand it wrong. Mira knew, the way she always knew. She was 7, but she had her mother's gift for reading the temperature of a room. "You're thinking about the engines again," she said one night at dinner. "How can you tell? You stirred your soup for about 10 minutes without eating it." He looked down. The soup was cold. "Sorry, bud." "I don't mind," she said. "You get that same look when you're doing something interesting. Mom used to say you had 2 faces, a regular one and an engine one." He laughed, which surprised him. It still surprised him sometimes, that laughter was still possible, that it could still arrive without warning and be welcome. "She said that?" "Yeah." Mira ate a spoonful of soup. I think she meant it as a compliment. What he found in the specs took him another 2 weeks to confirm, because he checked it 4 times before he was willing to believe it. The engines had never failed. Not a single one. Every failure report in the Alderton documentation referenced symptoms that did not match the actual condition of the units. The timing anomaly on Unit 3 was the most obvious proof, but it wasn't the only one. There were 5 discrete data points across 4 engines where the reported failure mode and the physical evidence simply didn't match. Not close misses, not ambiguous cases, didn't match. He called the number on Eleanor Alderton's card on a Tuesday morning, standing in the bay with the folder open in front of him. She answered on the second ring. The engines were deliberately failed, he said without preamble, because it seemed like the kind of thing she deserved to hear directly. Silence. "How certain are you?" she asked. "Certain enough that I'd say it in a room." Another silence. Longer. "Leonard Foss resigned 3 months ago," she said. "I thought it was retirement. Has anyone been in your records for the Mark 7 program?" A pause that told him the answer before she gave it. "Yes. We discovered an audit irregularity 4 months ago. I assumed it was administrative. I didn't connect it to the engines." Callum looked at the folder. He'd underlined things. He didn't usually underline things. "There are 6 engines here, Ms. Alderton, each one recoverable. Based on original spec, each one would have been worth." "I know what they were worth," she said. "I signed them off as scrap." "Someone let you do that on purpose." She didn't answer. He could hear her breathing, which was steady, which meant she was angry in the particular way that steady breathing means. "Finish the work," she said finally. "Please. I'll arrange for independent verification once you're done." And Callum. It was the first time she'd used his first name. "Document everything." "Already am," he said. Winter came the way it did in Copper Falls. Not suddenly, but firmly, like a decision that's been made for you. The shop was cold in the mornings until the space heater and the engine work brought the temperature up. Mira wore her coat inside until around 9, which she had decided was a reasonable rule, and which Callum had no argument against. He worked through November. The block repair on Unit 2 took 3 weeks because he was doing it right, which is a different timeline than doing it fast. He machined a section himself rather than risk a patch that would create problems 10,000 kilometers down the road. He wasn't sure anyone would ever put these engines in a vehicle. He built them like they would anyway. Some evenings Eleanor Alderton came by. Not every evening. Maybe once every 2 weeks at no fixed time, always calling ahead by about 20 minutes. She'd bring coffee in a thermos, 2 cups, and she'd sit on the stool at the end of the workbench while he worked. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She watched, mostly. Sometimes she asked about the process, not like someone checking on progress, more like someone who had spent decades being the person other people reported to and had forgotten what it was like to just be in a room where something was being made. Once she brought a second thermos with hot chocolate in it. "Your daughter," she said. "She mentioned it on the phone last time, that she liked it." Callum looked at the hot chocolate thermos sitting on the bench. He thought about Mira, who had talked to Eleanor Alderton on the phone. He hadn't known about that, who had apparently mentioned hot chocolate. "She talks to everyone," he said. "She's extraordinary," Eleanor said. Quietly. Not a compliment exactly, more like a statement of fact that she'd arrived at through observation and wasn't going to retract. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't come out wrong or overly formal. He went back to what he was doing. She poured the hot chocolate into one of the extra cups he kept above the sink. The independent verification happened in January. 2 engineers flew in from Edmonton, contracted by Alderton Precision, but neither of them people who had ever worked with Leonard Foss. They spent a day and a half in the shop. They asked questions. Callum was glad to answer, and some he had to go back to his documentation to answer properly. They looked at the timing anomaly on Unit 3 for a long time without saying anything. At the end of the second day, the senior engineer, a woman named Park, who had the kind of stillness that came from being right often enough that she'd stopped needing to announce it, sat across from Callum at his workbench and said, "You did meticulous work here." "The engines did most of it," he said. "I just read what they said." She looked at him for a moment. That's what good engineers say. After they left, he stood in the empty shop for a while. Mira was at a friend's house. The heater ticked. The 6 engines sat in their stations along the far wall, 5 of them complete, the 6th nearly there. He thought about the 11 years he'd spent writing reports with appendices. He thought about the moment, 4 weeks after Joanna died, when he'd sat in the garage at 2 in the morning and rebuilt a carburetor he didn't need to rebuild, just to have something that made sense under his hands. He thought about how the two things were connected, and how he hadn't understood that until now. Leonard Foss had, in fact, not retired. Eleanor told him in February. She came in the evening, no thermos this time, and she told him the whole thing plainly, which was the only way she ever told him anything. Foss had been consulting for a competing operation out of Ontario that had wanted Alderton's Mark 7 performance program dead. Not acquired, not replicated. Dead. If the program failed and the assets were scrapped before anyone could examine them closely, there would be no record left of Alderton's proprietary calibration work. It would simply cease to exist. The competing firm would then have a clear field to file their own patents on technology they'd reverse-engineered from stolen documentation. The audit irregularity had been Foss covering his tracks. Badly, in retrospect, but it had been good enough until Callum had written a letter on paper and described what he'd found in an engine that wasn't supposed to tell him anything. The RCMP opened an investigation in December, Eleanor said. I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't want to. She paused. I wasn't sure what the right thing was. It's all right, he said. It's not entirely all right. You were holding evidence, and I didn't tell you. He thought about that. He'd worked through Christmas with these engines, with Myra asking questions about valve clearances and accepting his patient answers with the same seriousness she applied to everything. He thought about what it would have felt like to know, during those weeks, what was sitting in the middle of the work. It's all right, he said again, and he meant it, which was different from being fine with it. Some things you could mean without being fine. She nodded. She looked for the first time since he'd met her, tired. Not the tired of a long day, the tired of something that had been going on longer than it should have, finally showing. What does the investigation mean for the program, he asked. It means the documentation is protected. The technology is Alderton's. She looked at the 6 engines. And those? She stopped. Say it. They're worth approximately what I should have known they were worth before I let Leonard hand me a report and signed off on it without looking. She said it flat. No performance. Just the fact. Each unit in working condition is worth roughly $500,000 to a precision motorsport buyer. He let that number sit in the air. You knew the value going in, he said. When you sent the truck, I knew the value of what they were supposed to be, she said, not what they actually were. There's a difference. She looked at him. You found the difference. The 6th engine was on the stand behind her. He'd done the final compression check that morning. It had come in clean, every cylinder, no variation worth noting. They're finished, he said. She turned and looked at the engine. She didn't say anything for a long time. They're yours, she said finally. I want that to be legal and documented, and I've had someone draw up a transfer of title. That's not? He stopped. That's not why I did this. I know it isn't. She looked at him directly in the way she had that left no room for softening. That's precisely why I want you to have them. The spring came slowly, the way it does in that part of Ontario, reluctant, and then suddenly everywhere. Mud and snowmelt, and the particular smell of the first week that's genuinely warm. Callum opened the big bay door for the first time in months and stood in the opening with his coffee and listened to Copper Falls waking up. The engine sold over 6 weeks, not all at once, not to a single buyer. 1 went to a racing team in Quebec. 2 went to a collector in British Columbia who had been looking for this specific calibration for 3 years. 1 went to a heritage motorsport organization in Toronto that had been patient and thorough in their inquiry. The remaining 2 were purchased by a performance engineering shop in Nova Scotia that Callum had spoken with twice on the phone before agreeing because he'd wanted to know the work would be understood. He didn't keep the money in a pile somewhere and look at it. He paid off the building, which had been carrying a note since his father's time. He set aside a third for Mira. Not for anything specific, just set aside, in the patient way. He reinvested a portion into equipment the shop had needed for 2 years, including a proper engine hoist that didn't require swearing at the crank to get it moving. Mira was there the morning the last engine left. She stood in the bay doorway watching the truck pull away, the way she'd watched the first truck arrive. Do you miss them? She asked. He thought about it honestly, because she deserved honest. A little, he said. The way you miss a problem once it's solved. Not the problem, just the having something to figure out. She considered this. Will there be another one? Probably something, he said. She nodded, like this was a satisfactory answer, which, from Mira, meant it was. Eleanor Alderton called that evening. He'd expected she might. She had a habit of checking in at the moments that seemed like endings, which he'd come to think was her way of making sure they weren't. The last one went today, he told her. I know. The Nova Scotia shop called me. A pause. How are you doing? It was a simple question. He gave it a simple answer. Good, he said. Better than I expected. That's the best kind, she said. Outside, the bay was empty. The floor was clean. He'd swept it that afternoon, the particular satisfaction of a clean floor after finished work. The heater was off. The spring evening came through the open side door, cool but not cold, carrying the specific smell of mud and new grass and the end of a long season. Mira was inside doing homework at the kitchen table, and every few minutes she called out a question about fractions, about a word she didn't recognize, about whether Canada geese honked or quacked, which was a question he hadn't expected and which he got wrong on the first try. He stood in the empty bay a little longer than he needed to. He'd come back to this building because he needed something small he could shape around a life. He'd found in the end that small wasn't quite the right word. The right word was true. Something true he could build around the rest of it. The floor was clean. The engines were out in the world. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough.